My name is Dr. Martin Mitchell, and for the past 15 years, I've dedicated my career to analyzing historical photographs for anomalies that conventional science struggles to explain. As a professor of historical documentation at Georgetown University, I've examined thousands of images from the early photographic era, searching for evidence of phenomena that exist at the boundaries of our understanding. Most of my colleagues would call this work fringe research, but I've learned to look beyond the obvious, to seek the stories hidden in plain sight within these frozen moments of time. I was drawn to this field after discovering something extraordinary in my grandmother's attic when I was 12 years old. Among her collection of family photographs, I found an image that would change the trajectory of my entire life. It was a picture of my great-great-grandmother's wedding party from 1923, and standing clearly among the guests was a figure that shouldn't have been there. A woman in outdated clothing, her face partially obscured by shadows, but unmistakably present in what should have been a joyous family celebration. The disturbing part wasn't just her presence, but the fact that according to family records, she had died 3 years before the wedding took place. That discovery sparked a lifelong fascination with photographic anomalies, leading me to specialize in what I call temporal documentation, the study of images that capture more than they were intended to. Over the years, I've investigated haunted daguerreotypes from the Civil War era, analyzed spirit photography from the Victorian spiritualism movement, and examined countless family portraits where deceased relatives appear alongside the living. But nothing in my extensive research prepared me for what I discovered in a routine digitization project last autumn. The photograph that would consume the next several months of my life came to me through the most mundane of circumstances. The Riverside County Historical Society in California had received a grant to digitize their extensive collection of early 20th century school photographs, and they needed an expert to authenticate and catalog the images. As someone who had published extensively on educational photography of that era, I was the natural choice for the project. The collection consisted of hundreds of class photos dating from 1895 to 1925. Documenting the growth of public education in what was then a rapidly expanding agricultural community. Most were typical group shots. Rows of serious-faced children posed formally in front of their one-room schoolhouses, their teachers standing proudly beside them. These images serve as invaluable historical records, capturing not just the faces of past generations, but the clothing styles, architectural details, and social customs of their time. I had been working through the collection methodically for about 3 weeks when I encountered the photograph that would challenge everything I thought I knew about historical documentation. It was labeled simply as Pine Ridge Elementary School, class of 1906, spring term. The image showed 23 children arranged in 3 rows on the steps of a modest wooden schoolhouse. Their teacher, Miss Catherine Wells, according to the school records, positioned at the far left of the group. At first glance, it appeared to be a perfectly ordinary school photograph from the Edwardian era. The children were dressed in the typical fashion of the time. Boys in dark suits with high collars, girls in long-sleeve dresses with their hair neatly braided or pinned. Their expressions were appropriately solemn, as was customary for formal photography of that period, when exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still for several seconds. The schoolhouse behind them was a classic example of early 20th century rural architecture, with its simple wooden construction, tall windows, and modest bell tower. Everything about the photograph spoke to the earnest educational aspirations of a growing American community, a testament to their commitment to providing learning opportunities for their children despite the challenges of frontier life. But as I began the detailed analysis that each photograph required, scanning the image at high resolution and examining every detail for historical significance, I noticed something that made me pause. In the back row, standing slightly apart from the other children, was a figure that didn't quite fit with the rest of the group. At first, I attributed this to a simple matter of lighting or positioning, but the more closely I examined the image, the more unsettled I became. The child, for lack of a better term, appeared to be roughly the same age as the other students, perhaps 10 or 11 years old. But there was something fundamentally different about their appearance that I couldn't immediately identify. The clothing seemed appropriate for the period, though perhaps slightly more formal than what the other children wore. The posture was correct for a formal photograph, hands clasped properly, feet positioned as instructed by the photographer. Yet something about this figure created a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Perhaps it was the way the light seemed to interact differently with their form, creating shadows that fell at odd angles compared to the other children. Or maybe it was the expression on their face, which even in the formal style required by early photography, seemed to convey an emotion that didn't match the occasion. I decided to examine the image under magnification, using the specialized equipment in my laboratory that allows for detailed analysis of photographic details invisible to the naked eye. What I discovered when I enhanced the resolution would begin a journey into territory that challenged my understanding of both photography and history itself. Under magnification, the anomalous figure became even more disturbing. While the other children in the photograph showed the natural imperfections and variations you would expect in any group portrait, this particular child appeared almost too perfect, as if their image had been somehow enhanced or altered. Their facial features were symmetrical to an unnatural degree, and their eyes seemed to look not at the camera, but directly at the viewer, regardless of the angle from which the photograph was examined. Most unsettling was the discovery that this figure appeared to be slightly transparent. While the children on either side were clearly solid and opaque, blocking the view of the schoolhouse steps behind them, I could faintly make out the wooden planks and architectural details through the anomalous child's form. It was as if they were present, but not entirely there, occupying the same space as the photograph, but existing in some different plane of reality. I spent several days analyzing this single image, running it through every photographic authentication test at my disposal. I examined the paper stock, the chemical composition of the developing agents, the type of camera likely used based on the lens distortion patterns. Everything confirmed that this was an authentic photograph from 1906, developed using the standard techniques of that era. There was no evidence of double exposure, no signs of later manipulation or retouching. Yet the presence of this transparent figure defied conventional explanation. Early photography was notorious for technical glitches that could create ghosting effects or unintended double exposures, but those typically produced obvious distortions or overlapping images. This was different. The anomalous child was perfectly positioned within the group, appropriately scaled, and showed none of the telltale signs of photographic error. Determined to understand what I was seeing, I began researching the history of Pine Ridge Elementary School and the individuals who appeared in the photograph. The school records from that era were surprisingly well preserved, thanks to a dedicated local historian who had spent decades collecting and organizing educational documents from the county's early years. I was able to identify most of the children in the photograph through enrollment records, attendance logs, and cross-referencing with other school photos from the same period. 22 of the 23 figures could be matched to specific students who were documented as attending Pine Ridge Elementary during the spring term of 1906. But the anomalous child, the one whose image had initially caught my attention, appeared in no records whatsoever. There was no enrollment document, no attendance record, no mention in the teacher's notes or the school board minutes. According to every official document that survived from that period, this child had never existed, never attended Pine Ridge Elementary School, and certainly had never been present on the day this photograph was taken. The mystery deepened when I contacted descendants of the families whose children appeared in the photograph. Many still lived in the area, their family histories well documented through generations of local residents. I interviewed elderly residents who had grown up hearing stories about the old school, examined family photo albums and genealogical records, even consulted with the local cemetery to see if there might be burial records that could explain the presence of this mysterious figure. What I discovered would prove far more disturbing than a simple case of missing school records. According to multiple independent sources, including several family histories that had been passed down through oral tradition, there had indeed been a 23rd child at Pine Ridge Elementary School during the spring of 1906, but this child had died in a tragic accident several weeks before the school photograph was taken. The child's name was Thomas Whitmore, and according to the accounts I gathered, he had been eagerly anticipating the annual school photograph. His younger sister Mary, who also attended Pine Ridge Elementary, had told her grandchildren years later about how Thomas had spent weeks preparing for picture day, carefully mending his best shirt and polishing his shoes until they gleamed. On March 15, 1906, just 10 days before the scheduled photography session, Thomas had been walking home from school when a sudden spring storm struck the area. The normally placid creek that ran alongside the schoolhouse had swollen with rainfall and snowmelt from the nearby mountains, transforming into a rushing torrent that swept away everything in its path. Thomas, attempting to cross at his usual spot, was caught by the current and carried downstream. His body was recovered 3 days later, nearly 2 miles from where he had fallen in. The entire community was devastated by the loss, and according to the school records I eventually located in a different archive, classes were suspended for a full week to allow families to grieve. The planned school photograph was postponed out of respect for the Whitmore family, who had lost their eldest son in such a tragic manner. When classes finally resumed and the photographer arrived to take the delayed group portrait, Thomas Whitmore had already been buried in the Pine Ridge Cemetery, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross that his father had carved himself. Yet somehow, inexplicably, he appeared in that photograph, standing in his usual spot in the back row where the taller children were positioned, wearing the very shirt he had so carefully prepared for picture day. The implications of this discovery sent chills through my entire body. I had spent years investigating photographic anomalies, but I had never encountered anything quite so definitive, so well documented, and so impossible to explain through conventional means. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or poor record keeping. Thomas Whitmore had died, been buried, and mourned by his community. Yet there he stood, captured forever in that spring photograph, present among his classmates as if death itself could not keep him from participating in this important school tradition. I decided to expand my investigation, traveling to Pine Ridge to examine the physical evidence that might still exist from that period. The original schoolhouse had been demolished in the 1940s, replaced by a more modern brick building that served the community until the district consolidated in the 1980s. But the cemetery where Thomas was buried remained largely unchanged, a peaceful plot of land on a hillside overlooking what had once been the heart of the small farming community. Finding Thomas Whitmore's grave proved surprisingly difficult. The wooden markers from that era had long since rotted away or been knocked down by weather and time. The Cemetery Association's records were incomplete, and many of the older sections had been reclaimed by native vegetation. I spent an entire afternoon walking through the overgrown areas, using a metal detector to locate possible grave sites and cross-referencing my findings with what few burial records had survived. Eventually, with the help of a local historian named Robert Chun, I located what we believed to be Thomas's final resting place. The grave was unmarked, distinguished only by a slight depression in the earth, and the presence of several large stones that might have once formed a border around the plot. Chun, whose family had lived in the area for 4 generations, remembered his grandfather mentioning the Whitmore tragedy and pointing out the approximate location of the boy's grave during family visits to the cemetery. Standing there in that quiet place, surrounded by the weathered headstones of Thomas's contemporaries, I felt the weight of the mystery I was investigating. Here was a child who had been loved, mourned, and laid to rest by his community over a century ago. Yet somehow, his image had appeared in a photograph taken after his death, captured with the same clarity and presence as his living classmates. I photographed the gravesite extensively, documenting the location and the surrounding area for my research files. As I worked, Shun shared what he remembered of the local folklore surrounding the old school and the families who had lived in the area during the early 1900s. According to the stories passed down through generations, strange occurrences had been reported at Pine Ridge Elementary for years after Thomas's death. Teachers and students alike spoke of seeing a boy matching Thomas's description in the hallways and classrooms, always appearing briefly before vanishing when approached. Books would be found open on desks in the morning, arranged as if someone had been studying during the night hours when the building should have been empty. Children reported hearing footsteps in the corridors during recess, following the familiar pattern of someone walking from the classroom to the water pump outside, a route that Thomas had taken countless times during his life. These accounts had been dismissed by most adults as the product of grief and imagination, the natural result of a close-knit community struggling to cope with the sudden loss of one of their children. But the stories persisted for decades, passed down from older students to younger ones, becoming part of the school's unofficial history, long after most people had forgotten the specific details of Thomas Whitmore's tragic death. What made these accounts particularly intriguing was their consistency across different time periods and witnesses. The descriptions of the boy's appearance remained remarkably similar from the 1900s through the 1930s, when the last reported sightings occurred. He was always described as wearing the same dark suit and white shirt that appeared in the school photograph, always carrying himself with the same serious demeanor that characterized formal photography of that era. Most significantly, multiple witnesses reported that the apparition seemed particularly drawn to photography sessions. Whenever the school arranged for group portraits or other formal pictures, teachers would notice an extra child in the arranged groups, standing exactly where Thomas would have been positioned based on his height and age. When they turned to look directly at this figure, it would fade away, leaving only the enrolled students in their proper places. I began to understand that the 1906 photograph was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that had continued for decades. Thomas Whitmore had somehow remained connected to his school and his classmates, appearing whenever formal documentation was taking place, as if his spirit understood the importance of being included in these permanent records of his community's history. The more I learned about Thomas and the circumstances surrounding his death, the more convinced I became that I was dealing with something far beyond the realm of conventional photographic analysis. This was not a technical glitch or a case of mistaken documentation. This was evidence of consciousness persisting beyond physical death, manifesting in ways that our current understanding of reality could not adequately explain. But my investigation was far from over. The 1906 photograph had opened a door to questions that would take me deeper into the intersection of historical documentation and paranormal phenomena than I had ever ventured before. And as I would soon discover, Thomas Whitmore's story was only the beginning of a much larger mystery that had been hiding in plain sight within the archives of American photographic history. The photograph of Thomas Whitmore had consumed weeks of my research, but I knew that to truly understand the implications of what I had discovered, I needed to expand my investigation beyond this single image. If Thomas had indeed appeared in his school photograph after death, there might be other cases hidden within historical archives, waiting for someone with the right expertise to recognize their significance. I began systematically searching through photographic collections from the same era, focusing specifically on group portraits from schools, churches, and community organizations. My methodology was painstaking but thorough. Each image underwent the same detailed analysis I had applied to the Pine Ridge photograph, with particular attention paid to figures that seemed somehow out of place or exhibited the subtle transparency that had first alerted me to Thomas's anomalous presence. Within 2 months of beginning this expanded search, I had identified 17 additional photographs from across the United States that contained similar anomalies. These images spanned from 1898 to 1923, representing a 25-year period during which early photography was becoming increasingly common in American communities. The geographic distribution was remarkable, stretching from Maine to California, with no apparent pattern based on region, climate, or local customs. What united these photographs was the presence of figures that, upon investigation, proved to be individuals who had died shortly before the images were captured. Like Thomas Whitmore, these people had maintained some form of connection to their communities that transcended physical death, allowing them to appear in formal documentation alongside the living. One particularly compelling case emerged from a church photograph taken in Millbrook, Vermont, in 1914. The image showed the congregation of St. Mary's Episcopal Church, posed on the steps of their newly constructed sanctuary, celebrating the completion of a building project that had taken 3 years to complete. Among the 67 people in the photograph stood a woman in her 40s, wearing a dark dress appropriate for the formal occasion, her hands clasped in front of her in the standard pose for group photography. Church records identified this woman as Margaret Sullivan, who had been one of the most dedicated fundraisers for the building project. She had organized bake sales, quilting circles, and community dinners to raise money for the construction, working tirelessly to ensure that her congregation would have a permanent place of worship. Margaret had died of pneumonia in February 1914, 6 weeks before the building was completed and 2 months before the celebratory photograph was taken. Yet there she stood among her fellow parishioners, positioned exactly where she would have been, based on her height and social standing within the congregation. Her image showed the same subtle transparency I had observed in Thomas's photograph, allowing the architectural details of the church steps to be faintly visible through her form. Most remarkably, several surviving members of the congregation, interviewed in the 1970s as part of an oral history project, specifically remembered Margaret's presence at the celebration, despite the fact that she had been dead for months. These witnesses described seeing her during the photography session, standing in her usual spot among the church ladies, smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see her dreams fulfilled. Only later, when they examined the developed photograph, did they realize the impossibility of what they had witnessed. Their memories of that day remained vivid decades later, a testament to the profound impact of encountering something that challenged their understanding of life and death. The pattern repeated across multiple photographs and communities. In each case, the deceased individual had been deeply connected to the group or institution being documented. They were teachers who appeared in school photographs after their deaths, community leaders who manifested in town celebrations, family patriarchs and matriarchs who materialized for formal portraits they had been eagerly anticipating. These were not random hauntings or meaningless supernatural occurrences. They represented a form of consciousness that remained tethered to earthly concerns, particularly the desire to be remembered and included in the permanent record of community life. Early photography, with its formal nature and documentary purpose, seemed to provide a medium through which this desire could be fulfilled. My research took on new urgency as I began to understand the broader implications of these discoveries. I was not simply documenting photographic curiosities, but uncovering evidence of human consciousness persisting beyond physical death in ways that mainstream science had never acknowledged. Each photograph represented an individual story of love, dedication, and connection that had proven stronger than mortality itself. The technical aspects of these manifestations fascinated me as much as their emotional significance. In every case, the anomalous figures appeared with remarkable consistency in terms of their photographic properties. They exhibited the same slight transparency, the same perfect positioning within the group, the same absence from official records, despite their clear presence in the images. This suggested that whatever force allowed these individuals to appear in photographs operated according to specific principles that could potentially be understood and documented. The manifestations were not random or chaotic, but followed patterns that indicated an underlying order to the phenomenon. I began collaborating with physicists and consciousness researchers, sharing my findings with experts who might help explain the mechanisms behind these appearances. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist at Stanford University, became particularly intrigued by my research. She theorized that consciousness might exist as a form of quantum information that could persist beyond the death of the brain, occasionally interacting with physical reality under specific conditions. According to Dr. Vasquez's hypothesis, early photographic processes, with their reliance on chemical reactions and light-sensitive materials, might have been particularly susceptible to these quantum interactions. The formal nature of group photography, with its emphasis on documentation and permanence, could have created an environment where persistent consciousness found a way to imprint itself onto the photographic medium. While this remained highly theoretical, it provided a scientific framework for understanding phenomena that had previously been relegated to the realm of supernatural speculation. My photographic evidence was giving credibility to concepts that mainstream academia had long dismissed as impossible. The more photographs I analyzed, the more convinced I became that I was documenting a previously unknown aspect of human experience. These images were not hoaxes or technical errors, but genuine records of consciousness transcending physical death to maintain connections with loved ones and communities. Each discovery reinforced my belief that historical photography contained far more information than we had ever realized. These cameras had captured not just the visible world, but glimpses into dimensions of existence that remained largely hidden from ordinary perception. My role had evolved from that of a simple historical analyst to something approaching an archaeologist of human consciousness, excavating evidence of our deepest connections to one another and to the communities that shape our lives. The implications extended far beyond academic research. These photographs offered comfort to those grieving loved ones, suggesting that death might not represent the absolute termination of human relationships that we had always assumed. They challenged our understanding of consciousness, memory, and the nature of existence itself. As word of my research spread through professional networks, I began receiving photographs from colleagues, museum curators, and private collectors who had noticed similar anomalies in their own collections. Each new image added to the growing body of evidence that consciousness could indeed persist beyond physical death, at least under certain circumstances and in specific forms. The response from the academic community was mixed. Some colleagues embraced my findings as groundbreaking research that opened new avenues for understanding human consciousness. Others dismissed my work as wishful thinking or misinterpretation of photographic artifacts. The controversy only strengthened my resolve to continue the investigation, knowing that paradigm-shifting discoveries always face initial resistance. I established a formal database of anomalous historical photographs, creating detailed records of each image, its provenance, and the circumstances surrounding the deceased individuals who appeared in them. This database would serve as a resource for future researchers and provide a foundation for more comprehensive studies of post-mortem consciousness manifestations. The work was emotionally challenging as well as intellectually demanding. Each photograph represented a human story of loss, love, and the desperate desire to maintain connections that death had seemingly severed. I found myself deeply moved by the dedication these individuals had shown to their communities, a dedication so profound that it had somehow transcended the ultimate boundary of human experience. My investigation had revealed that the 1906 Pine Ridge School photograph was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a much larger phenomenon that had been occurring throughout the early decades of photography. Consciousness, it appeared, was far more persistent and resourceful than anyone had imagined, finding ways to participate in the documentation of human experience even after the body had ceased to function. This realization would lead me to even more startling discoveries as I continued my research, uncovering evidence that challenged everything I thought I knew about the relationship between life, death, and the mysterious force we call human consciousness. But the most significant breakthrough in my research came when I began investigating a phenomenon I started calling temporal clustering. As I analyzed the dates and locations of the anomalous photographs more carefully, I noticed that certain time periods and geographic regions showed dramatically higher concentrations of these manifestations. The years 1906 to 1918 produced nearly 60% of all documented cases, while specific communities seemed to experience multiple occurrences within relatively short time frames. This pattern suggested that external factors beyond individual attachment might influence the ability of consciousness to manifest in photographic documentation. I theorized that periods of social upheaval, collective trauma, or significant cultural transition might create conditions more conducive to these appearances. The early 20th century, with its rapid technological advancement, social change, and the devastating impact of World War I, represented exactly such a period of transformation. My hypothesis gained support when I discovered a remarkable cluster of cases from San Francisco during the months following the 1906 earthquake and fire. No fewer than 12 photographs from the Reconstruction period contained figures of individuals who had perished in the disaster, appearing in images documenting the rebuilding efforts. These manifestations seemed particularly drawn to photographs celebrating community resilience and renewal, as if the deceased residents wanted to participate in their city's recovery. One of the most compelling examples came from a photograph of the dedication ceremony for a new elementary school built to replace one destroyed in the disaster. The image showed Mayor Eugene Schmitz cutting a ceremonial ribbon while dozens of community members looked on, their faces reflecting hope and determination despite the recent tragedy. Standing among the crowd was Dr. Benjamin Crawford, a beloved physician who had died while treating earthquake victims, his medical bag still visible in his translucent hand. Dr. Crawford's appearance in this photograph was particularly significant because multiple witnesses had reported seeing him during the ceremony. Unlike other cases where the anomalous presence was only discovered during later analysis, several attendees specifically mentioned Dr. Crawford's participation in contemporary newspaper accounts of the event. They described feeling comforted by his presence, interpreting it as a sign that those who had died in service to their community continued to watch over the survivors. The San Francisco cases provided crucial evidence that these manifestations were not merely photographic curiosities, but genuine interactions between persistent consciousness and the physical world. The witnesses' contemporary accounts eliminated the possibility that these appearances were later misinterpretations or wishful thinking projected onto ambiguous photographic details. This realization led me to examine newspaper archives from the communities where anomalous photographs had been discovered. I was searching for contemporary accounts that might mention unusual sightings or experiences during the photographic sessions. What I found exceeded my most optimistic expectations. In community after community, local newspapers from the early 1900s contained brief mentions of strange occurrences during formal photography sessions. These accounts were typically buried in social columns or presented as humorous anecdotes rather than serious reporting, reflecting the era's reluctance to openly discuss supernatural phenomena. Yet the consistency of these reports across different regions and publications suggested a widespread recognition of something extraordinary happening during group photography sessions. The Millbrook Herald, covering the St. Mary's Church dedication I had investigated earlier, included this telling passage in their society column. Several parishioners remarked upon feeling the presence of our dear departed Sister Margaret Sullivan during yesterday's celebratory photograph. While some attributed this to the emotional nature of the occasion, others insisted they glimpsed her familiar figure among the assembled congregation, a testament to her enduring devotion to our church family. Similar accounts appeared in dozens of local newspapers from the period. The language was often circumspect, couched in terms of feeling a presence or sensing beloved spirits, but the underlying message was clear. Communities across America were experiencing visitations from deceased members during their most important photographic documentation sessions. These contemporary accounts provided crucial corroboration for my photographic evidence. They demonstrated that the anomalous figures I was discovering in historical images had been noticed and discussed by the people who were actually present when the photographs were taken. This eliminated any possibility that I was simply projecting supernatural interpretations onto natural photographic artifacts. Armed with this expanded understanding, I decided to investigate whether similar phenomena might be occurring in more recent photography. If consciousness could indeed persist beyond death and manifest under certain conditions, there was no reason to assume this ability had disappeared with the advent of modern photographic technology. I began reaching out to contemporary photographers who specialized in formal group portraits, particularly those who worked with institutions that maintained strong community connections. Wedding photographers, school portrait specialists, and documentarians of religious ceremonies became valuable sources of information about unusual experiences during their work. The results were startling. While modern photographers were initially hesitant to discuss supernatural encounters, many had indeed experienced unexplained phenomena during formal photography sessions. Digital cameras would malfunction inexplicably, capturing extra figures that shouldn't have been present. Light meters would register impossible readings. Most significantly, photographers would sometimes notice additional people in their viewfinders who weren't visible to the naked eye. Rebecca Martinez, a wedding photographer based in Santa Fe, shared an experience that perfectly illustrated the continuation of this phenomenon into the digital age. During a ceremony at a historic chapel, she had noticed an elderly woman in formal attire standing at the back of the church, apparently watching the proceedings with great interest. The woman wasn't on the guest list, but her presence seemed natural and appropriate given the solemnity of the occasion. It was only when Rebecca reviewed her digital files later that evening that she realized the implications of what she had captured. The elderly woman appeared clearly in multiple shots, but according to the bride's family, she matched the exact description of the bride's grandmother, who had died 6 months earlier. The grandmother had been deeply disappointed that her illness would prevent her from attending her granddaughter's wedding, expressing her regret repeatedly during her final weeks. Rebecca's photograph showed the grandmother positioned exactly where she would have chosen to stand during the ceremony, in a location that offered the best view of the altar while remaining respectfully unobtrusive. Her image exhibited the same subtle transparency I had observed in historical photographs, allowing architectural details to show through her form while maintaining perfect clarity of facial features and clothing. The bride's family was initially skeptical when Rebecca shared the images, but their skepticism transformed into amazement when they recognized not just the grandmother's appearance, but the specific dress she was wearing in the photographs. It was the same outfit she had purchased months before her death, specifically for the wedding, an ensemble that had been buried with her because she had been so excited about wearing it to the ceremony. This case provided compelling evidence that the phenomenon I had been studying in historical photographs continued to occur in the present day. The mechanisms that allowed consciousness to manifest during formal documentation had not disappeared with technological advancement, but had adapted to work with digital imaging systems. I began collaborating with contemporary photographers to document these modern manifestations more systematically. We developed protocols for recognizing and recording anomalous appearances, creating a database of current cases that could be compared with historical examples. The consistency between past and present cases was remarkable, suggesting that we were dealing with a fundamental aspect of human consciousness rather than a quirk of early photographic technology. The modern cases also provided opportunities for more immediate investigation. Unlike historical photographs where decades or centuries had passed since the original events, contemporary anomalous images allowed me to interview witnesses while their memories remained fresh and to examine the circumstances surrounding each manifestation in greater detail. These investigations revealed additional patterns that had been difficult to detect in historical cases. The deceased individuals who appeared in modern photographs invariably had strong emotional connections to the events being documented. They were parents who appeared at their children's graduations, spouses who manifested at anniversary celebrations, founders who showed up at institutional commemorations. Most significantly, the appearances seemed to occur specifically during moments of joy, achievement, or community celebration. These were not random hauntings or expressions of unfinished business, but conscious choices by persistent awareness to participate in meaningful events. The deceased individuals were not trapped or suffering, but were actively choosing to maintain their connections to the people and institutions they had loved in life. This realization transformed my understanding of death itself. Rather than viewing it as an absolute termination of consciousness, I began to see it as a transition that might allow for different forms of interaction with the physical world. The photographic evidence suggested that love, dedication, and community connection could indeed transcend physical mortality, at least under specific circumstances. My research had evolved from documenting photographic curiosities to exploring fundamental questions about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to physical existence. Each new case added to a growing body of evidence that challenged conventional assumptions about death and suggested possibilities for human experience that mainstream science had never seriously considered. The implications extended far beyond academic research. These photographs offered hope to grieving families, evidence that their loved ones might continue to exist in some form beyond physical death. They suggested that the bonds we form during life might persist in ways that allow for continued interaction and mutual support. As I prepared to publish my findings, I knew that I was presenting evidence that would challenge fundamental assumptions about consciousness, death, and the nature of reality itself. The photographic documentation was undeniable, the witness accounts were consistent, and the patterns were too clear to dismiss as coincidence or wishful thinking. The 1906 school photograph of Thomas Whitmore had opened the door to understanding that consciousness might be far more resilient and resourceful than anyone had imagined. My investigation had revealed not just isolated instances of post-mortem manifestation, but a systematic phenomenon that had been occurring throughout the history of photography, continuing into the present day with remarkable consistency. These discoveries would force a fundamental reconsideration of what it means to be human, what happens when we die, and how the bonds we form during life might transcend even the ultimate boundary of physical existence. The camera, invented to capture the visible world, had inadvertently become a window into dimensions of human experience that remained largely hidden from ordinary perception. The evidence was mounting, case by case, photograph by photograph, that death might not be the end of human consciousness, but merely a transformation that allowed for different forms of participation in the ongoing story of human community and connection. The weight of my discoveries was becoming overwhelming. Each night, I would return to my apartment with boxes of photographs and witness testimonies, spreading them across my dining room table like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The evidence was undeniable, yet I struggled with the implications of what I was uncovering. How could I present findings that challenged the very foundation of our understanding about life and death? My academic reputation was already under scrutiny. Colleagues who had once respected my work on traditional historical photography were beginning to distance themselves from what they perceived as my descent into pseudoscience. Department meetings became uncomfortable affairs where my research was met with skeptical glances and barely concealed disapproval. The university administration had started questioning the allocation of resources to my project, suggesting that perhaps my time would be better spent on more conventional historical documentation. But I couldn't abandon the investigation, not when the evidence continued to mount with each passing week. The database I had established now contained over 200 verified cases of post-mortem photographic manifestations spanning from 1895 to the present day. The patterns were becoming increasingly clear, revealing a complex system of rules and conditions that governed these appearances. One of the most significant discoveries emerged when I began analyzing the emotional states of the communities where these manifestations occurred. In every single case, the photographic sessions had been preceded by periods of intense collective emotion, whether grief, celebration, or significant life transitions. It was as if the heightened emotional state of the living participants created a kind of psychic resonance that allowed consciousness to breach the boundary between life and death. The technical analysis proved equally revealing. Working with Dr. Marcus Chun, a specialist in photographic chemistry at the California Institute of Technology, I discovered that the anomalous figures consistently exhibited specific light absorption patterns that differed from normal photographic subjects. Using spectral analysis equipment normally reserved for forensic investigation, we found that these manifestations interacted with light in ways that suggested they existed in a slightly different dimensional space, while still remaining visible to photographic equipment. Dr. Chen initially approached our collaboration with considerable skepticism, agreeing to analyze my samples primarily as a favor to a mutual colleague. However, his scientific objectivity couldn't ignore the consistent patterns we were discovering. The spectral signatures of the anomalous figures were remarkably uniform across different time periods, geographic locations, and photographic technologies. Whatever was causing these manifestations operated according to consistent physical principles that could be measured and documented. The breakthrough came when we analyzed a photograph from 1912 that showed the dedication ceremony of a new library in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The image contained the figure of Samuel Morrison, the town's former librarian who had died of tuberculosis 3 months before the building's completion. Morrison had spent the final years of his life campaigning for the library's construction, organizing fundraising drives, and personally petitioning wealthy residents for donations. Using advanced spectral analysis, Dr. Chen discovered that Morrison's image exhibited a unique form of light interference that suggested his consciousness was somehow manipulating electromagnetic radiation to create a visible presence. The effect was subtle but measurable, indicating that whatever force allowed these manifestations to occur operated within the known laws of physics, even if we didn't yet understand the specific mechanisms involved. This discovery provided the scientific credibility my research desperately needed. Dr. Chun's reputation as a rigorous physicist lent weight to findings that might otherwise have been dismissed as supernatural speculation. We began collaborating on a series of papers that would present our evidence to the scientific community in terms they could understand and evaluate. Meanwhile, I continued investigating individual cases, drawn deeper into the personal stories behind each photographic anomaly. The more I learned about these deceased individuals, the more I understood that their post-mortem appearances were not random occurrences, but deliberate acts of love and dedication. They were choosing to manifest during the most important moments in their communities' lives, driven by connections that had proven stronger than death itself. One particularly moving case involved a photograph from 1919, showing the Welcome Home celebration for soldiers returning from World War I in Millfield, Massachusetts. Among the crowd of family members and townspeople stood Captain Robert Harrison, wearing his military uniform with unmistakable pride and joy. According to military records, Captain Harrison had been killed in action at the Battle of Belleau Wood nearly a year earlier. His widow, Martha Harrison, had organized the Welcome Home celebration as a tribute to all the local men who had served in the war, including those who would never return. Contemporary newspaper accounts described her speech at the event, where she spoke movingly about how the fallen soldiers remained present in spirit, continuing to serve their community even in death. The photograph captured what Martha Harrison seemed to sense during her speech. Her husband stood directly behind her as she addressed the crowd, his translucent hand resting gently on her shoulder in a gesture of support and approval. Witnesses interviewed decades later remembered feeling an unusual sense of comfort during Martha's speech, as if the fallen soldiers were indeed present to witness the homecoming they would never physically experience. This case illustrated another crucial aspect of the phenomena I was studying. These manifestations were not simply random appearances of the deceased, but conscious acts of communication and support. Captain Harrison had chosen to appear at an event organized by his widow, positioning himself in a way that would provide her comfort even if she couldn't consciously perceive his presence. As I sit here in my study, surrounded by hundreds of photographs that challenge everything we thought we knew about consciousness and death, I'm struck by a profound realization. The camera lens, invented to capture the visible world, has inadvertently become humanity's most reliable witness to the invisible bonds that connect us across the boundaries of life and death. Thomas Whitmore, standing eternally in that 1906 school photograph, represents far more than a paranormal curiosity. He embodies the enduring power of love, dedication, and community connection that refuses to be silenced by mortality itself. My 15 years of research have revealed that we are not alone in this universe, not in the way we've always assumed. The evidence is undeniable, documented in silver halide crystals and digital pixels across more than a century of photography. Consciousness persists beyond physical death, choosing to manifest during our most meaningful moments, drawn by bonds of affection that prove stronger than the grave. These discoveries challenge the very foundation of how we understand human existence. They suggest that death is not an ending, but a transformation that allows for different forms of participation in the ongoing story of human community. Every wedding, graduation, and celebration carries the potential for reunion with those we've lost, their presence captured not just in our hearts, but in the permanent record of photographic documentation. The skeptics will continue to dismiss these findings, as they must. Paradigm shifts always face resistance from those invested in current understanding. But the evidence speaks for itself, accumulated case by case, photograph by photograph, witness by witness. We are more than flesh and blood, more than neurons and synapses. We are consciousness itself, capable of transcending the physical limitations that define our earthly existence. The implications extend far beyond academic research. For grieving families, these photographs offer hope that death is not the absolute termination of relationship we've always feared. For communities mourning their losses, they provide evidence that their departed members continue to watch over them, participating in the milestones and celebrations that define collective life. As I continue this investigation, I'm humbled by the responsibility of documenting phenomena that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about reality. Each photograph represents a story of love that refused to be extinguished, of dedication that transcended mortality, of consciousness that found a way to persist beyond the boundaries of physical existence. The 1906 school photograph of Pine Ridge Elementary will always hold special significance in my research. It was Thomas Whitmore's image that first opened my eyes to the possibility that our cameras might be capturing far more than we ever realized. His presence in that class portrait, standing proudly among his classmates despite having died weeks earlier, serves as a testament to the resilience of human consciousness and the enduring power of connection. Perhaps most remarkably, these manifestations continue to occur in our digital age, adapting to new technologies while maintaining the same essential characteristics observed in early photographic processes. This suggests that we're dealing with a fundamental aspect of human consciousness, rather than a quirk of outdated equipment. The phenomenon is not fading with technological advancement, but evolving alongside our methods of documentation. The database I've established now serves as a repository of evidence that consciousness can indeed persist beyond physical death, at least under specific circumstances involving strong emotional connections and formal documentation. Each case adds another piece to a puzzle that reveals the true nature of human existence as something far more complex and enduring than we've ever imagined. Moving forward, I'm committed to expanding this research, collaborating with physicists, consciousness researchers, and other experts who can help explain the mechanisms behind these manifestations. The spectral analysis conducted with Dr. Chun has provided scientific credibility to phenomena that might otherwise be dismissed as supernatural speculation. We're discovering that these appearances operate within measurable physical parameters, even if we don't yet fully understand the processes involved. The work continues, driven by the same curiosity that led me to investigate that first anomalous photograph in my grandmother's attic so many years ago. Each new case brings fresh insights into the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. The evidence is mounting that love, dedication, and community connection can indeed transcend the ultimate boundary of human experience. For those who have lost loved ones, I offer this comfort. The bonds you formed during life may persist in ways that allow for continued interaction and mutual support. Your departed family members and friends may indeed be present during your most important moments, captured not just in your memories, but in the permanent record of photographic documentation. The camera has revealed truths about human existence that challenge our deepest assumptions about life and death. These photographs serve as windows into dimensions of experience that remain largely hidden from ordinary perception, offering glimpses of consciousness that refuses to be constrained by physical mortality. As we stand on the threshold of new discoveries about the nature of human consciousness, I'm reminded that science has always advanced through the investigation of phenomena that initially seemed impossible. The photographic evidence I've documented represents just the beginning of what may prove to be a fundamental shift in our understanding of what it means to be human. The story of Thomas Whitmore and the countless others who have chosen to manifest in formal photographs reminds us that we are part of something far larger and more enduring than our individual physical existences. We are consciousness itself, participating in an ongoing narrative of human community and connection that transcends even death. In the end, these photographs tell us that love never truly dies. It finds ways to persist, to manifest, to participate in the continuing story of human experience. The camera, in its faithful recording of light and shadow, has become our most reliable witness to this profound truth about the nature of human consciousness and its remarkable ability to transcend the boundaries that define our earthly existence.